Until very recently, the United States was the only player in the game when it came to drones. We had drones of every size, from things the size of a grasshopper to things the size of a 737. What is unique about the American drone system, and so what we thought was true about all drone systems, was that they were expensive and they were in small numbers. American technology, when it comes to the military, has always been about quality over quantity, because wherever we go in the world, we will always be hideously outnumbered. So we've got to be able to punch harder at a further distance. And that's the Reapers, and that's the Predators, and that's the Special Forces drones, all of that. What we have seen in the last few years, however, is that there's a cheap approach, that there's nothing about the technology that says it has to be top notch. And if you make 50 really, really cheap ones, you can still do a lot of damage. Now, for the United States, I'd say that kind of the problems fall into two general categories. The number one is the new Joint Strike Fighter, which is supposed to be our only airborne weapons platform for the next 20 years. Its range is somewhat limited, and those little Iranian moped drones have greater range than the Joint Strike Fighter. So all of a sudden now, our weapons platform, to be perfectly blunt, is broadly useless. Because if they were to launch 1,000 of those things at a base where the JSF was based, one of them is going to get through, no matter how good your defenses are. So that limits the sort of military activity the United States can do, largely removes our ability to have air cover from ground installations. We'll have to do it only from naval platforms. The second problem we've got is anyone can do this. I mean, Hamas is many things, but an economic player, no. A technological player, no. And the fact that you can basically put these together in your garage and launch them by the dozens makes for a different sort of conflict. Now, that works both ways. And what the United States military is doing is something called the Replicator Initiative, where it will basically start using American resource scale to build Hamas-style drones. And the goal is to be able to independently attack 2,000 Chinese targets and destroy them within 24 hours using our naval platforms. So basically, things like destroyers and, God forbid, carriers just carry tens, if not hundreds of thousands of these things, and we just launch a locust swarm. So two can play by this game. But it does mean that the military tactics that we use are going to have to evolve. Instead of having a very small number of very high-end military vehicles, you just launch a cloud of very low-end stuff that is attritable and disposable. I don't think people have thought through how much that gives the advantage to a country like the United States. We will have to fight differently, and kind of the sunk costs that we've put into some of these technologies are suddenly going to become very questionable. But there is no country in the world that can adapt in the way the United States can. So let's say 2 years from now, we have a direct fight between the Americans and the Chinese. Sure, they can build a lot of drones, but they have to target something that they can't see and that can move. And AI is nowhere close to being able to target things over the horizon where they have to do a search pattern. Whereas the US Navy is going to know exactly where their targets are. They're on land with satellite recon, we can find them. And we just launched 10,000 drones at whatever it happens to be. This is a really, really bad development for the Russias and the Chinas and the Irans of the world, getting the Americans to think about this differently. Because our ability to adapt to that environment, combined with our mobile firepower of the Navy, that's going to be crippling for all of them. Most of the stuff we sent to Ukraine is hand-me-downs that we haven't used in over 25 years. And honestly, the Russians are doing a favor because we're disposing of it into their teeth. Otherwise, we would have to dispose of it ourselves, which would cost money. So actually, the Russians are doing a financial solid by absorbing that ammo for us. Israel's a little bit different. Israel is a much more technologically acute force, and they're after things that are precision guided, and that they have to get from the United States. So the financial cost of supporting Ukraine is very, very low in real terms. The financial support of Israel is much, much, much higher. That said, this is a country of only 8 million people, and they're trying to carry out a military operation in a zone that's only twice the size of the District of Columbia. So the scale of the needs is relatively low in comparison to what the U.S. military is capable of. There is no economic outcome from the Gaza operation. It's a non-factor economically. And from a strategic point of view for the United States, it's also a non-factor. The only way it matters is through second, third, and fourth degree steps that none of which are guaranteed to happen, none of which are likely to happen. But Ukraine, couple orders of magnitude more important. This is the ninth war that the Russians have launched since 1991 in an attempt to reshape their neighborhood. And if they succeed in Ukraine, Ukraine doesn't solve their strategic problems. They're trying to build a better external crustal defense. Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland solve that problem. So if Ukraine falls, we will have a different war, and one where the United States will have boots on the ground and nukes will fly. So blocking the Russians from advancing past Ukraine is a core national interest of the United States. In addition, the economics of this speak for themselves. You've got the world's number one wheat exporter and number five wheat exporter locked in a war. It involves the world's largest and third largest sources of potash fertilizer. It involves the world's second largest sources of oil and natural gas. The economics of this are immense. I can think of no better way of showing you that everyone who was Republican who could do math has been ejected from the party than talking about how Republicans are now against assisting a country that is a democracy have failed, an economic conduit that's critical in order to hold back a irredentist power that holds huge control over wide swaths of the global economic system. I mean, it's like this should be the type of conflicts that traditional Republicans are all about because it stops so many things. But instead, we've got this wing of the party that has managed to take over and clearly can't find Canada on a map or do basic math. We will find a way to make it work because the alternative is to risk losing American cities. We found out in the Battle of Kiev that the Russians were incompetent at modern warfare. They're not any good at logistics. Their training was atrocious. And the fact that you've got Ukraine, which functionally didn't have a military on the first day of this war, that it still exists, is a testament not necessarily to Ukrainian pluck and creativity, but Russian absolute and utter incompetence. And so if we see the Russians prevail in Ukraine, when they reach the NATO border, a fight between the NATO forces, who are the best in the world, and the Russians, who are definitely in the bottom half, would be a bloodbath, and the Russians would be obliterated. But that doesn't change any of their strategic needs. And so nukes would come into play. And the Biden administration, because it's led by a guy who predates the splitting of the atom, knows this in his gut, and we will find a way to make it work. The Russian demographic is one of the worst in the world. This is their last generation where they can try to use conventional military force to reshape it. They know that this is their last shot. They know that this is their last decade as a coherent conventional military power, despite all their flaws. And so they're going to push until they get to a border system that they can hold with a degrading internal system. That goes all the way to Warsaw. There's a reason that the Biden administration has fast-tracked absolutely everything involving missile defense. By the books, by the numbers, we certainly don't have enough missile defense to protect against a broad-spectrum Russian strike. However, keep this in mind, every weapon system, every economic system that the Russians have used in the last 2 years has failed pretty dramatically. To think that all of the nukes are the one thing that works to spec, I think takes a little bit of analytical creativity. Basically, what the Biden administration is dealing with is the four previous administrations abdicated pretty much all global involvement. While I can argue that the United States, because of its insulation and its economic structure and its demographic patterns, is actually in a really good spot for not just today, but for the long term, that does mean that there are a lot of things that have gone down that we've lost the ability to influence easily. This is one of them. Our biggest failure of the Clinton administration specifically, was ignoring the Soviet collapse and not managing the fallout. And we are still paying for that. We are still trying to clean that up. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit in the United States when it comes to making budgetary savings. We have a healthcare system that is by far the most expensive in the world, twice that of your average first world country. And if we're able to just kind of go to a middle of the road system, we'd save 10% of GDP right off the top, which would pay for everything we're discussing here, in addition to entitlement reform. Would pay for it all, just that one thing. I would love to see meaningful healthcare reform in this country. Barring that, as long as the United States is the sole currency, and again, there's no pretender to the throne at the moment, we do have the option of monetizing. That is not my preference, but it seems to be the preference for the last 5 political administrations. And honestly, if Americans had a problem with that and wanted to have a different system, they would have voted for the other guy every single time. There's an opportunity cost here. If we had stuck with what Bill Clinton did with the balancing of the budget back in the 90s, not only would we not have a budget deficit today, but we would have paid for the retirement of the baby boomers. But we chose a different road. There's a difference between the opportunity cost and a national cost. There's no alternative for anyone right now. And honestly, the more the US withdraws from the world economically, the more viable the US dollar becomes as the global currency. Because the first thing you want from a currency is for whoever controls it to not intervene in currency markets to benefit themselves. I feel bad about this. I'm a fiscal conservative, but people who feel my way have been out of power now for a very long time.